We are told from the moment we take a breath in this country that America is an exceptional nation, that we are the freest nation the world has ever seen because we were founded on these majestic ideals that most of us can recite from the Declaration of Independence without even having to look at the paper. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights. This is central. It is the heart of American identity. And yet, we were not a democracy at our founding. We were not a democracy until centuries of Black American resistance got us as close to democracy as possible with the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So I wanted to begin taking on that idea of democracy and who has truly been the democratizing force in America, and therefore who are truly this country's founders, which I argue, of course, are Black Americans. My name is Nicole Hannah-Jones, and I'm a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine. I am a veteran journalist who has been writing and investigating racial inequality and the way that it is maintained through official policy and action for the last 2 decades. I'm the creator of the 1619 Project. The 1619 Project was a multi-platform effort to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the first Africans being sold into the colony of Virginia. That anniversary was August of 2019, and so we released a special issue of the magazine, an entire special section of the newspaper, as well as a podcast. And the purpose of that was to really show that the date 1619 had been largely obscured from the American narrative, and yet it's one of the most foundational dates in American history, because that marks the beginning of American slavery. And so much of our modern institutions, everything from capitalism to the music we listen to our politics, even to our congested highway systems, can be traced back to that moment in 1619 and the legacy of American slavery. So as the creator of the 1619 Project, I knew that probably the most important essay, the essay that had to open the project, would be an essay on democracy. It would be an essay that was really looking at the unparalleled role that Black Americans have played in establishing democracy in our country. Most of us acknowledge that Black labor built some wealth in our country, but we actually played a much more unparalleled role. It was more than our brute labor. It was the idea of democracy and forcing our country to actually live up to its founding ideas. And that's what the essay on democracy in the 1619 Project that I wrote is really about. It's a journey taking us through how Black people have been the perfecters of American democracy, even though we don't get that credit. I begin the essay, therefore, with my father and this flag. I talk about as a high school student how my father, a military veteran, a man born into racial apartheid in Greenwood, Mississippi, flies his flag in our front yard. And I don't know how tall the flagpole was, but as a kid, it seemed like it was the tallest thing in our city. And I didn't understand how my dad could have this kind of outward patriotism for a country that never treated Black people as full citizens. So I start with that image for a couple of reasons. We have seen throughout history Black Americans trying to wrap themselves in the American flag as they are trying to demand their civil rights, their basic rights, and their rights of citizenship. If you think of every protest movement, you see Black people holding up American flags, wrapping the American flag around their bodies. We have to show that we are worthy of citizenship of our own country.
Black lives matter! 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 Black lives matter!
So I wanted to start with that image because I think it's an image that all Americans can connect to. It was an image that I hoped would disarm people into getting into what was going to be a very difficult essay about the hypocrisy of this country and the hypocrisy of our founding. And I also wanted to show my own grappling with the idea of patriotism, that Black people have always, of course, had a very difficult relationship with our own country and these ideas of patriotism, a very conflicted relationship. We are American, of course, Slavery ensured we have no other country we can claim besides America, and yet we have had to fight every moment of our lives in order to be recognized as citizens. So I really wanted to tackle this conflicted sense of what does patriotism look like, who has ownership over the American story, and what is the role that we as black people have played in this country. And so that's why I started with the flag, and that's also why I took on this very idea of democracy. Black people are the most inconvenient people to the American story of exceptionalism. By very virtue of us being here, gives lie to the idea of exceptionalism, of us being the freest country the world has ever seen, because the only reason black people are here is because of slavery. The only reason black people are here is because nearly half of the men who we consider our founders engaged in the institution of slavery and denied absolute liberty to 1/5 of the population of the 13 colonies, while making the argument that they needed to break off from Britain and found this new nation called the United States in order to be free. So, of course, black people are not going to be central to the stories of democracy in a country built on anti-democracy and actually slavery when it came to black folks. When we look at the way that we have been taught to think about black Americans, it has always been to treat black people as a problem, that we are problematic, untrustworthy, lazy people who are somehow deserving of the conditions that we're in. This is a way to justify this founding hypocrisy of being a nation founded on the ideas of liberty and the practice of slavery. It is the least surprising thing that when we talk about American democracy, we don't talk about black people in the unparalleled role. We can look as recently as this generation we call the greatest generation, the World War II generation, where ostensibly we were sending soldiers abroad to liberate and bring democracy back to Europe. And those soldiers, if they were black, didn't enjoy democracy back home. In fact, they returned to a country that was violently depressing democracy for its black citizens. And actually, black soldiers were in peril when they dared to wear their uniforms in America, the uniforms that had been welcomed abroad when they were treated as liberators. So we can't really grapple with this mythologizing around America and then deal honestly with black Americans and the role that black people have played, which is black people read those words in our founding documents that were not meant to apply to them, but they said, we believe that these words apply to us, and we are going to fight this country against our own country to make those words true for all Americans. And that's the role black people have always played and continue to play. We are all taught that 1776 is the founding of our country, because that is the year that the colonists issue the Declaration of Independence from Britain. This is when they argue that Britain is so oppressive against the white colonists that they need to be free. They need to found this new and free country. So, of course, that is a foundational moment. But the 1619 Project argues that we should maybe consider the year 1619 as a founding moment as well. Because 1619, of course, being the year that the first Africans were sold into the colony of Virginia as enslaved people, that so many of our fundamental contradictions, our tensions, our political problems, our disparities and our inequalities, they began not in 1776, where slavery had already been established and thriving for 150 years in the colonies that would become the United States in 1776. But really that those tensions, that founding paradox begins in 1619. What's important to understand when we talk about American slavery is one argument we hear all the time is, well, slavery is a very ancient institution, and lots of societies practice slavery. And that is true. But racial slavery was a distinct form of slavery that had not really existed in the world. And in fact, historian David Blight argues that there have only ever been 5 slave societies in the history of the world. What chattel slavery did was it wasn't merely about we have captured someone in war, and as punishment, we're going to enslave them. It was a slavery that was heritable, meaning you were born into slavery, you inherited your enslaved status from your mother, and you would die into slavery, and every generation after you would be born into slavery, live in slavery, and never know freedom. It was race-based. Never in the history of the world was slavery based simply on what race you were. Chattel slavery meant that you were no longer a human being. You were property that could be bought and sold at whim, that could be used as a mortgage, as collateral, that could be gifted. You had no rights in society whatsoever. You existed outside of the body politic. Some people consider chattel slavery to be what's called a social death, in that you have all of these human beings who have no role in society any different than the cattle that these people also owned. That was a unique and singularly barbaric form of slavery. And for 250 years in this country, even before we were a country, generations and generations of Black people were born into a system of slavery where they never had a hope to be free, where they never had a hope to have the protection of the law, where they never had a hope to be able to acquire wealth or property for 250 years. That type of slavery did not exist in the world. It's important to understand when we think about our founding. One of the things we hear a lot is, well, those were men of their times, and we can't judge them based on the morals of today. So it should be clear, there was never a time where people did not understand that buying and selling human beings was wrong. They were willing to do it because of the great profits that could be made, but they understood that it was wrong. And our founders understood that it was wrong. They understood that the hypocrisy of making arguments for liberty, of drafting a Declaration of Independence that calls for the inalienable God-given rights of all men, and drafting a constitution that guaranteed rights to all men. And so as they're drafting these documents, they both want to protect the institution of slavery. It is not incidental that so many of our founders engaged in slavery. Slavery was an extremely profitable system. It is what gave so many of the founders the wealth and education that allowed them to think they could break off from the most powerful empire in the world at the time, which was Great Britain. So they needed to protect their property and financial interests, but they didn't want to create the world's first written constitution, one that argued for the rights of men, and enshrine that hypocrisy of denying all rights to 1/5 of the population in that founding document. So they found ways to do it without mentioning slavery. When we've all been taught about the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise is how to apportion congressional representation based on population, when in many parts of the American South, large segments of the population, in some places like South Carolina, the majority of the population were enslaved people who could not vote, who could not exercise politics, and yet the Southern colonists wanted those people to count when it came to getting seats in Congress that would give them more political power. So the 3/5 compromise is, how do you count enslaved people when you are assigning representatives to different states? It never mentions the word slavery. There are several other places dealing with how do you put down insurrections. For instance, the Second Amendment, when it talks about insurrections and the right to bear arms, those insurrections are the insurrections of people who were enslaved, who were following the lead of the revolutionaries and taking up arms against their oppressors as well. So there are at least 5 different passages in the Constitution that explicitly deal with the issue of slavery and yet never mention the word. They are trying to cover up their sin while they're also protecting their greatest financial assets. So in fact, the first time that you see the word slavery or slaves mentioned in the Constitution is in the 13th Amendment after the Civil War, and that is because the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, but you never see the word in the Constitution before that. We don't have to guess how enslaved people and free Black people viewed the Constitution, viewed the Declaration, and viewed the words of the white founders, because they told us. They saw the words of the Declaration and they saw the words of the Constitution, and they said, this has to mean that slavery must end, because you can't say all men are created equal and yet hold us in bondage. And so Black folks really took those words and they took them to heart in newspapers like the Freedom's Journal or the North Star, founded by Frederick Douglass. They would use those words to really call out the hypocrisy of this country and to take up the mantle of the revolution as their mantle for fighting for independence as well. So we don't have to guess. The reason Black people have become have long been this nation's most ardent freedom fighters, is they saw that glaring hypocrisy and they were determined to use the words of our founders against this country in order to try to force it to live up to its highest ideals. When I first started researching the democracy essay for the 1619 Project, I had no idea that it would ultimately become a patriotic essay. A lot of people have asked me, when did I come to understand why my dad would fly this American flag for a country that didn't treat Black people as full citizens? And I tell them that I came to understand that as I was reading and researching and writing this essay. Because what became clear is that Black people had no reason to want to stay in this country, had no reason to believe that this country would ever live up to its founding ideals. And yet, generation after generation refused to pick up and go somewhere else. I was reading the texts of people like Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass, reading Sojourner Truth, and they were saying, we're not going to leave the country that we built. Our ancestors' blood is in this soil. Their bones are buried in this soil. And this is our country. How dare anyone try to make us feel that the country whose financial wealth we built, whose cultural contributions we created, and whose very democracy for all marginalized people exists, how dare anyone say that we can't claim this country, the only country that we ever know? So it was in writing that essay that I understood what my father was trying to do. I write in the essay that young people, we think we understand so much about the world when in fact we understand so little. And that there is a wisdom that my father could grasp that I couldn't understand because I didn't have enough years and I didn't have enough knowledge. That white Americans have wanted us always to feel as if we were aliens in our own country, as if we were an internal enemy. And the highest calling of patriotism is to say, not that we're going to wear a flag pin and say that our country can do no wrong, that it actually is critiquing your country to force it to live up to its highest ideal. It is a belief that your country can be the things that it says it can be, and that our duty is to fight to make that true. And that's what my father was doing, and that's the role that Black people have always played in this country. So don't get me wrong, I don't plan on flying a flag in my own yard anytime soon, but I certainly understand that Black people have a right to do that, and to not claim our legacy is to give up our inheritance, and we should never feel that that is the right thing to do.